Hello everyone. Tonight I take you on a museum tour, a private visit just for us, and I will be your guide. We are in Santiago, Chile, at the Museo Nacional de Historia Natural, the National Natural History Museum, and they were kind enough to let us in for the night. When there are no visitors, the lights are dimmed, and the halls, the corridors, the rooms, the high roofs, all the items on display just quietly wait in suspended time. We have a lot to discover. Fossils, zoological exhibits, displays with all sorts of ancient cultural artifacts, and I have tons of things to tell you about paleontology or archaeology in general and in this corner of the world, and also about natural history museums or galleries and this building itself, which has a history of its own. So make yourself comfortable, and as always, this video will wait for you if you fall asleep and wish to resume the visit later. You can use the chapters, the timestamps, and you can also close your eyes at any time if you wish to. You will still be able to follow and understand everything. Now let's push the doors and begin our visit. If you ever visited natural history museums in cities like Washington, London or Paris, and many other cities, you're going to be familiar with the main gallery that is at the center of the building. Typically, this is a place to display large animals, and here we have an entire whale skeleton, which has been here for more than a century. This is a sei whale, one of the largest animals on Earth. In terms of size and weight, the sei whale is only topped by the blue whale, which can weigh up to 200 tons, and the fin whale, up to 77 tons. They can be found in all oceans on Earth, and they are rarely seen from the coasts because they prefer deep offshore waters. As you know, whales belong to a group of aquatic mammals called cetaceans. But what do these terms, mammal, cetacean, whale, exactly mean? What are these different categories? The broadest, the most encompassing one is mammal. I told you about them in several past stories. Mammals are a very large group of vertebrate animals which are characterized by the presence of mammal glands in females, and they feed their young with milk. There are other things that distinguish them. Another one is that they have fur or hair, even though sometimes it is barely visible. And they also have 3 middle ear bones, which are hard to find because they are among the smallest in their bodies. These bones contribute to transmit sounds that travel in the air to the fluid-filled environment of our inner ear. Mammals also have a neocortex, a particular region of the brain that appeared in living beings on Earth with them. And these specificities allowed the identification of mammals as a separate class of animals, which can have very different shapes and sizes, but also have a common ancestor, and this ancestor would have diverged from reptiles, would have formed a different class by mutation, evolution, more than 300 million years ago. Since then, thousands and thousands of different species of mammals have appeared. Many went extinct, but nowadays there are more than 6,000 species of mammals that remain extant, alive, and we, Homo sapiens, are one of them. They are divided in different orders. There are 29 of these orders, like rodents, bats, primates, and these orders are themselves divided into infra-orders, subcategories. Cetaceans are one of these subcategories. They represent a small portion of mammals. The study of their evolution history suggests that cetaceans come from terrestrial mammals. One of the oldest members of ancient cetaceans is an extinct amphibious animal that has been called Pachycetus. It looked a bit like a wolf, about 3 to 7 feet long. It was carnivorous and lived in and around water, where it ate small animals and fish. It is believed that its lifestyle was comparable to seals. But Pachycetus had 4 very well-defined legs based on the fossilized skeletons that were found. And this animal lived about 50 million years ago. As difficult as it may be to imagine this, based on the recreation of its appearance, Pachycetus is thought to be an intermediate, a transitional stage between terrestrial mammals and whales. Actually, its closest non-cetacean relative is the hippopotamus, which is also probably the closest relative of modern whales on land. After Pachycetus, we have signs of a transition from land to sea with another genus, that is to say, another group of species, called Ambulocetus, which lived a bit later, 48 to 47 million years ago. It was bigger, up to 10 feet long, and still had limbs that were leg-like, but with a fully aquatic life. Ambulocetus literally means running whale, and it is believed it lives near the coastline, in mangroves, hunting for fish and other vertebrates. Jumping again a couple million years in time, fossil records indicate that new cetaceans appeared with a morphology that was increasingly adapted to life in the water. The limbs of these species were regressed, and their body shapes began to resemble modern whales. They became probably better swimmers, with a more streamlined body, but they could still move on land, clumsily, a bit like modern seals. And finally, the transition to a fully aquatic life, far from the shore, is believed to have happened about 40 million years ago. From that point on, there are no longer remains of cetaceans that could emerge on land. Their limbs no longer allowed it, and their bodies were now fully adapted to marine life. An example of this, and it shows that some cetaceans had already gained a lot in size during this transition, is Basilosaurus. The name Basilosaurus means king lizard. It is a misleading name that dates back from the first discoveries of its fossils, because it was not a lizard, but a whale. But still, the name stayed for this genus. There were different species of Basilosaurus, but they were all very large whales that fed on other marine mammals, on sharks, or on large fish. A really fierce predator, and possibly the largest animal of its time, 41 to 34 million years ago. Since then, whales have kept evolving. They are still carnivorous, but large whales don't have this predator reputation, because instead of hunting prey, they have evolved to feed on plankton. They ingest hundreds of pounds of smaller organisms every day that live in suspension in the sea. Sei whales, such as this one, do it through a filter feeding system that resembles bristles inside their mouth, called baleen. To use it, the whale opens its mouth underwater to take in water. Then it pushes the water out, and a lot of small animals, like krill, which is a collection of small crustaceans, are big enough to remain trapped, and then they are ingested. Other cetaceans hunt. Overall, the dozens of species of cetaceans are divided into two groups that are thought to have diverged 34 million years ago: filter feeding and toothed whales. Toothed whales include dolphins, of which orcas, killer whales, are a part of, and also beluga whales, or sperm whales. The relationship between humans and cetaceans is another topic on which I could make an entire story. There is generally a sense of closeness or empathy with them, probably more than with any other marine species, even though all cetaceans are predators, but this is not held against them. We are all mammals that care for their young, and that may be a factor. But the intelligence, the cognitive abilities of many cetacean species have been observed possibly since prehistoric times. This did not stop men from hunting whales, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, and bring some species to the brink of extinction. Things have improved since then, but several cetacean species are still precarious due to human activity. But still, we know that they can communicate. They can form small or large groups with a social organization. They have strategies to hunt. If you look at dolphins, for example, they bond between individuals. And these are certainly the elements that create an emotional bond with them. There could be a lot more to say about whales, but let's move on and take a look at this gallery where we are now. As I said at the beginning, this kind of architecture and this way of displaying items may be familiar. And this is no coincidence, because this museum belongs to an archetype, one that emerged in the 19th century. Until the 18th century, there were no museums of that kind, and actually very few public museums. In Europe, there were royal collections in some European countries that could be open to the public, and there were private collections which multiplied in the 18th century and were also called cabinets of curiosities or wonder rooms. The first public museums, owned or supervised by states, opened in the second half of the 18th century. For example, the British Museum opened to the public in 1759. But at the start, you had to apply to be admitted. Only small groups were allowed in, and in practice this limited access to the upper class or upper middle class, or scholars, experts. Then, over time, they became more democratic, and were increasingly seen as tools to educate the public, to make science advance. And the policy completely changed, from limiting access to trying to make as many people as possible visit. In 1793, museums like the Louvre or the Natural History Museum of Paris were created during the French Revolution with that kind of ambition, and it only grew along the 19th and 20th centuries. The concept of natural history was, and to a degree still is, a bit blurred and precise. It aggregates a lot of disciplines from biology or botany to anthropology, zoology, paleontology. The domain can be defined as the study of living organisms, past and present, or the study of nature. But typically, a natural history museum can have archaeological or mineral items on display that do not exactly fit these definitions. Maybe sometimes for practical reasons, because these institutions already existed and they were seen as the right place to conserve items. But the wonderful thing is that despite their expansion and the sometimes very large collections they have, these museums kept the diversity, the variety that made the appeal of cabinets of curiosities. Typically, a natural history museum only displays a fraction of its collection. They also keep many items that would be redundant or that are seen as less appealing to the public or that are too precious to be exhibited. And access to these specimens and items kept in reserve is limited to researchers, because they also are research institutions. And this modern definition of the Natural History Museum is from the 19th century. Chile's was created relatively early, in 1830. It was the first one in South America. But the building we're in did not exist yet. This building is from 1875. There was an international exhibition in Santiago, and the park where the museum is located was where this exhibition took place. There were temporary pavilions of the countries that participated, and this building was like the centerpiece of the event. Its architecture is typical of large public buildings of the time, in this Beaux-Arts style that you see in the centers of some European and American cities. They are ornate. They have large galleries where natural light can enter, and the visible parts are a mix of all the styles, classical, baroque, but the materials and building techniques were modern. Structures are metallic, for example. This type of central gallery, where a natural history museum puts large, spectacular items, trophies almost, like this whale skeleton, is as much a necessity to show them to the public as a way of attracting people to something spectacular, unusual. So this is the place for big pieces, and speaking of them, we also have a few examples of megafauna here, like a bison and one of the biggest bears in the world, a Kodiak bear. Megafauna, what does it mean, by the way? Literally, it means large animal life, but there is no official definition of the threshold. In practice, the term is used for terrestrial animals that are at least as big as humans. And the term is also often associated with the Pleistocene, the Ice Age, this epoch that preceded ours, when large terrestrial animals that are now extinct lived in many parts of the world. Mammoth, saber-toothed tiger, or woolly rhinoceros. And here, South America has a particular story, because for millions of years it remained separated, a large island continent. Around 110 million years ago, Africa and South America began to diverge along the mid-Atlantic ridge. The Atlantic Ocean began to expand. What is now the southern tip of South America was connected to Antarctica, and on the other side, Antarctica was connected to Australia. The three formed a landmass, a supercontinent called Gondwana. As South America and Africa were drifting away, Antarctica separated from South America 35 million years ago. And so South America became a massive island continent, like Australia is nowadays. A large, diverse, and biologically rich place that was cut by oceans that terrestrial animals could not cross. So species evolved separately. for more than 30 million years, until the Isthmus of Panama that connects North and South America appeared at the beginning of the Ice Age. When this happened, there was a big interchange of species. Large terrestrial animals that only lived in South America could spread north and vice versa. From the north arrived mammoths or predators like saber-toothed tigers, and in the other direction, North America received creatures that had never been able to leave their continent before. These include species of giant birds that are called terror birds. They were flightless, but fast on their legs, carnivorous, with a powerful beak, and it is supposed they preyed on small mammals. They may have prospered in South America when it was cut from the rest of the world, because they would have been among the top terrestrial predators for millions of years. Fossils of terror birds were found in North America, a species called Titanis, and it is believed they came from South America due to the similarities with their cousins from the south, and the absence of remains of fossils in North America that would be older than the Great American Interchange. Other extinct large animals from South America include several giant ground sloths like Megatherium. Megatherium was as big as an Asian elephant, weighing up to 8 or 9 tons, and 6 meters or 20 feet long. They were herbivorous and probably rather peaceful, because once adult, they would have lived with very few possible predators to bother them, and for millions of years. Like other large mammals, Megatherium went extinct around 10 to 12,000 years ago, at the end of the Ice Age. And it seems the arrival of humans, and with them hunting, was a major cause of this extinction. Part of the megafauna made it through our epoch: elephants, big cats, horses, or bears. And here we have a Kodiak bear from North America, also known as the Alaskan brown bear. This is one of the 2 largest bears alive today, together with the polar bear. Physiologically, the Kodiak bear is very similar to other brown bear subspecies, like the grizzly bear, for example. But apart from the regions they inhabit, the difference is the size. The Kodiak bear typically reaches 300 to 600 kilograms, that's 660 to 1300 pounds. And that's almost double the weight of other brown bears. The only native bear species in South America lives in the north of the Andes Mountains, in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, and it is called the spectacled bear. It is mid-sized, mostly herbivorous, even though its diet can become opportunistic when need be. Then we have a bison, another North American animal. The vocabulary can be a bit misleading here, because bisons are often referred to in America as buffaloes. But in the classification of species, buffaloes are Asian and African animals that are only related to bisons. They are all parts of a tribe, Bovini, that split about 5 to 10 million years ago into the buffaloes and another group leading to bison and taurine cattle. So in evolutionary terms, bisons are actually closer to cows than to buffaloes, but they are bigger than all of them, especially the American bison. The other extant species is the European bison, which can be a bit taller but not as heavy. American bisons were almost wiped out in the 19th century. Their population dropped to a few hundreds, but ranchers preserved and regrouped herds to save them. Then conservation measures were taken, and since then a healthier wild population has reappeared. The particularity of their behavior is that they travel in herds of the same sex. There are herds of females and of males. At 2 or 3 years of age, the bulls leave the herds of females and join a herd of males, which are generally smaller than female herds. They don't include the young. These two types of herds meet and stay together for a short time for the reproductive season at the end of the summer, and then they part ways again until the following year. Let's move on, and the next room is going to take us much farther into the past, with ancient marine reptiles. We always talk about fossils, but what are fossils concretely? The term fossil comes from Latin fossilis, obtained by digging, and it covers all remains, impression, or trace of any once living thing from a past geological age. It can be bones, shells, stone imprints of animals, objects preserved, for example in amber, petrified wood. Technically, coal or oil also are fossils. They are called fossil fuels. But the ones that interest paleontology are the ones that give information about past living creatures and plants, or help us date things and elaborate a geological timescale. But how do fossils form? Because when we see the skeleton of a dinosaur or a fish on a piece of rock, we are actually not looking at the matter they were made of. We are looking at an imprint or a natural recreation of their shape with mineral material, not the original organic material that made their body. There are several processes that are possible. The first one is called permineralization. It is when an organism of bones and tissues, animal or plant, is covered by a protective layer of sediments, for example, before it decomposes. In some cases, the parts, the spaces that were filled with water or gas when the organism was alive are progressively and very slowly filled with underground water, carrying minerals. These minerals stay, and the groundwater seeps into the pores of organic tissue and forms a crystal cast with deposited minerals. This happens on a cellular level, and this is why these fossils are sometimes very rich in information, because if they are in a good state, they are an extremely precise cast of the animal or plant. Eventually, the original tissue loses all its original water and air. Remains only the cell walls, taken in a mineral cast. Most dinosaur bones are of that nature. They are permineralized, and so is petrified wood. Another process is called orthogenic mineralization. In that case, it is not that the object is progressively modified, replaced by the passage of underground water that brings and leaves deposits of minerals. It happens when it is plunged in an environment which is saturated in a particular mineral. And due to this environment, a precipitation or recrystallization takes place. The minerals that were floating in water, in liquid, form solid deposits. This process is very common in deep-sea sedimentation. This is how calcium carbonate and many types of clays form. Yet another process is carbonization. This is the complex process that turns organic matter, like plants and dead animal remains, into carbon. Several chemical reactions take place that take out hydrogen and change the molecular structures. It is not the same as coalification. Carbonization is a series of chemical reactions, whereas coalification, the transformation of dead vegetation into coal, is a much larger process. It happens when dead vegetation was protected from biodegradation and oxidation, typically in wetlands. A dead tree falls into the mud or water, and in this protective environment, it turns into turf or peat. Eventually, giant peat bogs were deeply buried by sediments, and under a big layer of sediments, heat and pressure increased, which caused the loss of water, of methane and carbon dioxide, and left essentially carbon. This is how coal deposits formed, and also why their quality and energetic potential can vary a lot, because the coalification process depends on the heat and pressure conditions, and it takes millions of years. Now, returning to fossils, sometimes what we call fossil is a plaster cast of a shape, like a footprint, that has been miraculously preserved, and in that case, the fossil is the information, but the material to visualize it is modern and man-made. The discovery that fossils were natural replicas of dead organisms, and later the ability to date them by analysis, were giant leaps forward in the exploration and dating of extinct species. That applies to what we have here, marine reptiles. Nowadays there are still several varieties of reptiles that are adapted to aquatic life. They include sea turtles, sea snakes, and less common species like marine iguanas and saltwater crocodiles. But they had many, many predecessors, and some of them gigantic. The oldest group of fully aquatic reptiles that we know of are called mesosaurs, not to be confused with mosasaurs that I will tell you about in a minute. A mosasaur is the giant aquatic predator that appears in Jurassic Park movies. Mesosaurs lived long before that time, between 300 and 270 million years ago, and they were much smaller, a few feet at most, with the appearance of a small crocodile. But just the appearance, they were not apparented to crocodiles. Like with the case of cetaceans we talked about before, marine reptiles are an example of terrestrial life becoming amphibious and then returning to the sea. We lose the trace of mesosaurs 270 million years ago, but the niche they occupied did not disappear. And soon the food chains in the seas would be dominated by other reptiles, especially ichthyosaurs and sauropterygians, a group better known under the names of some of its members, like plesiosaurs or placodons. But let's take these names, these terms, one by one. Ichthyosaurs, which is Greek for fish lizard, looked a bit like dolphins. Their limbs had been fully transformed into flippers. But the difference with the fish is that these flippers could contain a lot of different digits and phalanges, the remains of their past as terrestrial animals. They breathed air, and their sizes varied from 1 to 20 meters. That's 3 to 66 feet. They all were predators, and between 250 and 90 million years ago, their representatives were among the top predators. During this very long period, many species of ichthyosaurs appeared and disappeared. They could have competed with the other big group of marine reptiles of these periods, sauropterygians, from Greek again, meaning lizard flippers. As far as we know, ichthyosaurs had a similar silhouette between them, even though their sizes could vary a lot. Sauropterygians took more varied shapes. They moved their tails vertically, like cetaceans, and contrary to ichthyosaurs, they may have lived like seals with periods in and out of water, at least at the beginning. An example of that are the nothosaurs that lived at the beginning of the period and averaged about 3 meters, 10 feet in length, with a long body and tail. They were contemporary of another branch, the placodons, tablet thieves, which were a bit smaller in average. It is believed placodons ate mollusks, and these flat teeth were useful to crush shells. Placodons evolved with heavier and heavier bony plates on their back, presumably to protect them while they fed, to the point that their appearance became almost similar to turtles. This evolution might have been a consequence of the progressive rise of bigger and bigger predators at the time, like ichthyosaurs and nothosaurs, that placodons needed to protect against, because their size was not enough. Around 200 million years ago, appeared another subgroup that would come to dominate the seas for dozens of millions of years, plesiosaurs. They also came in a variety of sizes, some of them reaching 17 meters. Some species had very long necks and a small head, typically how the Loch Ness Monster is portrayed, and they probably fed on small sea animals. Others were built with a short neck and a large head. These were the apex predators of their time, hunting large prey that probably included their fellow plesiosaurs. And they were not alone. In their last 40 million years of existence, they were joined by mosasaurs that are thought to have lived in shallow, warm waters and could reach similar sizes to the largest plesiosaurs, with very powerful jaws. Ancient oceans were always a dangerous place, but between 166 million years ago, they were possibly at their most dangerous and competitive, with that variety of large marine reptiles that sat on top of the food chains, above sharks that would displace them later, but that's another story. I said 66 million years ago because all these species went extinct in one of the most devastating extinction events in the history of life on Earth, the Cretaceous Paleogene event, the one that put an end to the domination of dinosaurs. Due to the collapse of food chains, no large-size animal made it to the following period, and with it, the era of marine reptiles dominating the seas ended. They did not disappear. Turtles or crocodilians survived this mass extinction. But when life radiated again, other predators took their place, including sharks or cetaceans. You remember we talked about Basilosaurus before, the large hunting whale. We have more corridors and halls to explore. And we are now arriving at a Moai, a statue from Easter Island. Easter Island is part of Chile, even though it is far off the coast. The inhabitants of Easter Island, the Rapa Nui, carved hundreds of them, more than 900, between the 13th and 16th centuries, before the arrival of any European explorers. The majority of Moais stayed or have been returned, for a few of them, to Easter Island. There is only a dozen authentified Moais that were taken to other parts of the world, to London, Washington, Paris, or continental Chile. To the Rapa Nui, the statues are the living faces of deified ancestors. They were extracted and carved in different quarries across the island, but their making stopped for reasons that are still debated. It seems the island suffered a collapse in population, possibly due to deforestation and overuse of resources, or wars, or disease, or several of these reasons combined. The island was not entirely depopulated, but when Europeans reached the island in the 18th century, in 1722, Easter Island's population was just 2,000 to 3,000. And from there, it got even worse. The introduction of new diseases, slavery, and immigration affected the population even more, so that by the late 19th century there were only a bit more than 100 inhabitants left. And the Rapa Nui as a people were close to disappearance. The island is very remote, about halfway between Chile and French Polynesia, and for a long time no foreign power claimed it, even though it was visited from time to time. So in 1888, Chile annexed Easter Island. The Rapa Nui population was able to recover somewhat, and nowadays there are 7,000 to 8,000 people living on the island, of whom half of them consider themselves Rapa Nui. Restoration work has helped preserve the Moais, the most visible trace left by their ancestors on the island. All of them had been toppled in the late 18th century, early 19th century, for unclear reasons, possibly tribal wars on the island. Some of them may also have fallen by themselves. But since then, many Moais have been put back in their initial upright position. They are now protected, even though they still stand outside and the elements, wind or rain, slowly erode them. Another precious relic kept at the museum is the Plomo mummy, also known as Boy of El Plomo, El Niño del Cerro El Plomo. This is one of the most valuable Inca relics in the world. And we are looking at an exact replica, not the original, which is kept here in the museum, but in closely monitored conditions of humidity and temperature. Another reason to not expose the original to the public is that these are the remains of a human being, and in past decades, museums have paid more and more attention to avoid the display of dead bodies out of respect. There may be important archaeological discoveries, but they are still human bodies. This boy was not intentionally mummified. He became a natural mummy because he died in altitude, where the air is dry and cold, which froze-dried his body, a process also known as lyophilization. The corpse was frozen due to the cold and desiccated, which preserved it perfectly for centuries, until it was discovered in 1954 near Santiago on a mountain. But rather than the preservation process, the interest here is archaeological. He was an Incan boy. Santiago is located in the central part of Chile, and the central part of Chile corresponded to the southern end of the Inca Empire. You know that the heart of the Inca Empire was in Peru, the region of Cusco, from where they expanded, subjugating peoples along the Andes Mountains, far north and far south. They stopped their expansion in the middle of Chile, south of Santiago, due to the distance, the resistance of the peoples who lived south of the frontier, especially the Mapuche people that we will talk about later. And also because of the arrival of Spanish conquistadors, which made their empire collapse at a time when it was still young and on the rise. maybe they would have expanded further, if not for the colonization process. We'll never know. So this mummy takes us at the time of the Middle Ages in Europe. Santiago was a few dozen miles north of the southern frontier of the Inca Empire. And this mummy is of particular importance because it testifies of ritual child sacrifices, an Inca ritual called capacocha. The Incas did not practice human sacrifice on a very large scale. Nothing to see with other pre-Columbian cultures from Mesoamerica, like the Aztecs. But regularly, they had highly ritualized practices that led to the sacrifice of children as an offering to the gods. The capacocha was one of the most important rituals in their calendar. It was dedicated to Viracocha, which could be described as a creator god. And this event took place between April and July, starting in the 13th century and until the early 16th century. From the four directions of the empire, people sent one or more kids to the capital, to Cusco, boys and girls that were considered beautiful and healthy. Many of them were sons of local chiefs, because offering a child was regarded as an honor, and probably also as a sign of allegiance. There may have been a political significance. The children traveled to Cusco, the symbolic center of the Inca universe, with an escort of priests, and once arrived, they participated in lengthy ceremonies and rituals involving dances, offerings, animal sacrifices. And along these ceremonies, the children were sanctified like sons of the sun, equivalent to the emperor, the Inca himself. They received presents worthy of their new status, and they were symbolically married between them. Finally, when all these rituals were over, all the kids were sent back to where they came from. But instead of using Inca roads, like the roads they had used to arrive, they had to travel in straight lines, whatever the obstacles, rivers, mountains, or valleys. And as they traveled on foot, the return trip could take months. The Plomo boy had to travel almost 2,000 miles, 3,000 kilometers, to cover the distance to and back from Cusco. Once they had arrived to their destination, there were local festivities, and the kids were taken to a high place. The study of this mummy and others suggest that they were numbed with alcohol or coca leaves. They were clothed and prepared with great care. And in this state of near unconsciousness, they were abandoned, buried to die from the cold, or briefly executed. The sacrifice had taken place. The exceptional thing with this relic is that the boy's body was frozen dried as it was. In his case, it seems he just died from the cold, numbed by chicha, a kind of beer made with corn. He fell asleep and never woke up. And then centuries passed, and he was found buried in a chamber that had never been violated, a chamber, a tomb, from which he could have had a spectacular view on the valley where Santiago is now built. And the way it is displayed here recreates the perspective with the mountains. The boy's clothes, the offerings, the way his hair was carefully arranged, the feathers, the ornaments, all of this testifies of the care people put in this ritual. It can sound cruel to us, but it was of deep significance for the subjects of the Inca. Chile has a rich heritage of native peoples before and after the Inca presence. The largest ethnic group by far in modern Chile are the Mapuche, a people that occupied regions on both sides of the Andes in today's Argentina and Chile. In Chile, they lived in the south-central regions. If you saw them in past videos, I showed you typical Mapuche artifacts, like silver jewelry. The Mapuche population accounts for about 10% of Chile's population. But there are other smaller indigenous minorities, Aymaras, Tiaguitas, Coyas, or Atacameños in the north. I mentioned the Rapa Nui from Easter Island before, or the Yamana, also called Yaghan in the south. And there are peoples or cultures that rose and disappeared before or after the arrival of European colonizers. Everywhere, these peoples showed an ability to adapt to very diverse environments. In the north of Chile is the driest desert in the world. In the south, in Patagonia, the cold can be intense. The Antarctic is not that far. And agriculture is barely possible. So people lived from hunting and fishing. This boat, this canoe, is an aiyusu, an ancient Yamana boat used for fishing and transportation. This group of indigenous peoples lived in the southern tip of South America, in the Tierra del Fuego archipelago, that is now shared between Argentina and Chile. They lived as south as around Cape Horn, a region of intense cold, winds, where the waves rise high, and the landscapes are spectacular with fjords and glaciers, but also rather inhospitable. The Yamana or Yaghan, these are two terms for the same group of peoples, lived a nomadic life. But why choose such a harsh environment when there were warmer regions to the north? Probably because they were driven south by enemies, and they adapted to their new land in a remarkable way. When European explorers arrived, they noted how they were indifferent to the cold. They had fires and small shelters, but they went about completely naked, or they swam in very cold water, hunting for shellfish. They slept in the open, naked, when Europeans shivered under blankets. Being cold when temperatures were almost freezing was just not part of their culture. They disregarded the sensation. Another distinct people from the extreme south, from Patagonia, is the Selk'nam people. Their population decreased from the 19th century. They were dispersed, often very brutally. They were hunted to make space for farming. Their culture declined to the point that they were considered an extinct people. Some of their descendants now try to revitalize their cultural heritage. They had a complex worldview, a mythology, a language, traditions, and one of them that looks haunting to us is the ceremony of passage to adulthood, the Yaghan. Teenagers between 14 and 18 were separated from their families for some time and painted with red clay. They were taken to a ceremonial place where they would be seated around a fire and asked to look up while adults, disguised as spirits in costumes that they had made for the ceremony, appeared and threatened them. They even wrestled with them until the adult had the upper hand because they were stronger. And after learning to fight the spirit and learning to admit defeat, the aspiring adult was shown that the so-called spirit was just a man of flesh and bone. And this was a valuable lesson. Appearances should not fool them. The ceremony extended for weeks or even months, during which the men learned to use weapons, to hunt, to obey orders from the elders, to work, and they were told the myth of creation and the origins of their world and society. Secrets that they were told to keep for themselves and not share, even with their wives, until they would themselves initiate new men in the future. There would be many more things to show you, but before we end our visit, let's take a look at some examples of the diversity of fauna in Chile. The country is incredibly long for its width, and that looks somewhat strange on a map. Why this shape? First, because of the geography. Chile has many characteristics of an island. From south to north, the Andes Mountains run all the way and form a natural barrier with its neighbor to the east, Argentina. And then there is history. When Latin American countries took their independence in the 1810s, the newly independent Chile was one of the most forgettable countries in South America. It was underpopulated. It had less than 1 million inhabitants at the time. It was small because only the central part of the country was under control. A big chunk of what is now the north of Chile belonged to Bolivia and Peru. And to the south, the government essentially had claims, but the land was occupied by the Mapuche and other peoples, meaning that you could not travel by land safely. All along the 19th century, Chile was expansionist, but not to the east, because the Andes were a formidable natural frontier, and on the other side there was Argentina, which was too big to face. So the expansion went south and north. South by subjugating native peoples and bringing in as many European colonists as possible. There are significant Chilean populations of German origin in the south of the country, for example, and they were actively invited in the 19th century. This policy didn't go without conflicts, and and the mistreatment of the natives, an heritage that Chile is still living with today. And to the north, the country expanded by war. There was a war with Bolivia and Peru that ended in the annexation of what is now the north of Chile. Since then, relations with Peru have normalized, but the biggest loser in this war was Bolivia, that lost its access to the coast and ended being landlocked. This happened 140 years ago, but the relations with Bolivia have never normalized, and to this day the countries do not have regular diplomatic relations. But what the length of the country means is a variety of climates, landscapes, and fauna. So let's take a look at a few examples. The south is famous for its variety of penguins. Penguins live almost exclusively in the southern hemisphere, so they are relatively common to people in Chile, Argentina, South Africa, Australia, or New Zealand, but they are exotic to the rest of the world. These birds do not fly, but they have adapted to aquatic life. Their wings have become flippers for swimming. They feed on fish, squids, small crustaceans that they can swallow while swimming. They spend about half of their lives on land and the other half at sea. A general rule is that the colder the climate, the bigger they tend to be. The largest living species is the emperor penguin, which is endemic to Antarctica. On average, adults of this species reach 3 to 4 feet and weigh around 35 kilograms, that's 77 pounds. They are very social animals that form large colonies, and when they breed, they form monogamous pairs. Depending on the species and colonies, these pairs may break up eventually, and individuals recouple. But what they all do is share the incubation duties after the female lays 1 or 2 eggs, except for the emperor penguin, where the male does everything. With this social life, penguins have developed a high level of social interaction. They have a wide range of vocal and visual displays to communicate. They use them to confront or drive off, to appease, to state their intentions. If we move a little bit north, frequent inhabitants of forests and mountains are pumas, also known as cougars. Pumas live in America, from Chile to Canada, and they are not endangered. They adapt very well. But they are elusive because they are very secretive despite their size. When COVID lockdowns started in Chile, it didn't take long before a few were spotted exploring the streets of Santiago in highly urbanized parts. They had not been seen in decades in such a place, but because it had suddenly become quiet, they had decided to go out and explore a little bit. Another animal that is typical of the Andean mountains is the condor, more precisely the Andean condor, because there is another species in North America, the California condor. The Andean condor is a vulture, that is to say, a scavenging bird. It doesn't hunt or search the ground for things to eat. It detects carcasses of dead animals thanks to its sight and good sense of smell, and it feeds on them. Bacteria that proliferate in this food source would be poisonous to other animals, but not to them. The same bacteria dominate their gut flora, and they thrive on eating decomposing meat. So, even though they may be impressive because of their size, and they have a slightly sinister reputation, vultures are harmless as long as you breathe. The Andean condor is impressive indeed. It is the largest flying bird in the world, be it by weight or wingspan. Its head and neck are featherless, and it is found near mountains because it likes elevated points to nest, up to 5,000 meters, that's 16,000 feet, generally on inaccessible rock ledges where its young will be safe. They only lay 1 or 2 eggs and take good care of their young, because condors live old, up to 70 years. Once they are adult, they have no known predators, and they can travel long distance to find food. It is not uncommon that they fly more than 100 miles in a day to feed. It doesn't take them that much effort, thanks to their wingspan. Once they are in the air, they let thermals, warmer winds, make them rise or keep them stay aloft. So they barely flap their wings, and to minimize their effort, they like to roost and launch from high places. But still, the species is vulnerable in some regions because of the loss of habitat due to human activity, or sometimes due to poisoning with lead if they feed on carcasses killed by hunters. The condor plays an important role in the folklore and mythology of Andean regions. Because of its size in flight, the altitude where it is observed, and its majesty, it was often associated with the sun deity, and it was believed to be the ruler of the upper world of heavens. I hope you liked this little visit. The museum is as quiet and peaceful as it was when we arrived. And in a few hours it will open its doors again for other visitors to come discover and enjoy this collection. I would like to thank the museum's administration for letting us in and helping make this visit possible. I invite you to visit the museum if you happen to be in Santiago. You will find a link in the description. Taking kids to a place like this and explaining them what they see is one of the coolest activities you can have with them. But it also works for adults, at least it does for me. I'll be back soon with another story, and in the meantime, I wish you a good, restful sleep. Sleep well. Sweet dreams. Au revoir.